alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us in our first research day. Is this connected, ya Jama'ah? So I can see my slides? My slides are not up. Okay, great. Let's get started. First of all, I'll have to, as always, disclose my conflict of interest. I don't have anything to disclose regarding this presentation. What I'm trying to do today is give you a glimpse of the overall clinical trials in a global perspective and reflect on the local perspective and compare where we are at when it comes to clinical trials. Now, I'm going to focus my talk on mainly the clinical trials, not the whole clinical research spectrum. And the reason for this is that this is one of the areas where we really need to improve when it comes to clinical research. Let's get started first by identifying why we need clinical trials, because many people think clinical trials are more of a luxury for clinicians or practitioners. It's more of towards the research that might not be attached or connected directly to our day-to-day work. And the main reason clinical trials are conducted, as you all know, is it's the access, the gateway to innovation. And in particular, when it comes to health, innovation. So the only way we can get innovative medications, innovative therapies, and innovative diagnostic modalities is by conducting clinical research. Not only this, it actually impacts on patient lives. How so? Many patients who have rare diseases that in the past never had any offered commercially available treatments look at the clinical trials as their last hope. And we see this a lot in many of rare diseases or difficult to treat diseases, oncology, hematology, immunology, and other genetics and rare diseases. The other thing is it actually impacts the whole economy. If you remember, in our Vision 2030, one of our KPIs is, or actually one of the pillars of Vision 2030 is thriving economy. And when you read about thriving economy in Vision 2030, you can clearly see that the goal is to improve the non-oil revenue generations and flip the equation where we currently have, or before we started Vision 2030, we had 60% coming from oil revenues from our GDP and 40% from non-oil revenues. The goal is to have it actually the opposite, 65 coming from the non-oil and 35% is coming from oil revenues. Now, clinical trials can be a great tool to improve the economy, and we're going to discuss this in details in a few minutes. Financial incentives for clinical coordinators, clinical researchers, principal investigators, institutions, and patients. So many patients actually, they get compensated on this. But also, patients get treated because most of the clinical trials, they cover the patient health care throughout the clinical trial period. Now, one of the things that we also need clinical trials for is to make informed decisions. There is no way we can make day-to-day decisions in our daily practice without going back to clinical trials and looking up the evidence. And also, we always depend on guidelines that are either locally or internationally that are based fundamentally on the level of evidence coming from clinical trials. Finally, and this is very important for Saudi Arabia, is positioning the country on a global research map. And I'm going to show you in a few minutes the research map Now let's talk a little bit about how clinical trials can impact the whole economy and how it can actually contribute to cost savings of healthcare. Let's look at UK, the first column. In the UK, between the year of 2016, 2017 until 2018, 2019, so only 2 years, they were able to generate £8 billion as part of the gross value added to the whole UK economy, only from clinical trials. Not only this, £355 million total estimated income for the National Health System, NHS, from delivering commercial clinical trials. If you look at the United States, and we're going to see where the United States in the global research map is, for 15 billion US dollars spent on clinical trials, it generated around 42 billion US dollars. So it's clear case, whenever you have more clinical trials, you can actually contribute to the economy of the country, whether it's in revenue generation, cost savings, participation in the GDP or others. Same thing in other countries, like Austria, for example. For every €1 invested by pharmaceutical companies in clinical trials, it generated around €2 for the Austrian economy. Not only revenue generation, but also cost savings. UK, for example, around £29 million estimated cost savings where trial drugs were used in place of standard only in 1 year. So actually you can save from the drug budget around 29 billion, and this was done only in UK. The second thing in Denmark, for example, 0.9 million Denmark corona GDP improvement from clinical trials, and 1.2 million improvement in the public budget. If you look at also another thing, when you bring clinical trials to your country, you actually contribute in generating new jobs and job opportunities, and also create incentives mechanisms for clinical researchers as well as patients. In UK alone, between the same period, 2016-17, 2018-19, around 48,000 new full-time equivalent jobs were created between this period, accounting for an average of £9,200 received per patients by NHS if they participated in the clinical trial. Now let's look at the general map. Now all of us know that US dominates this field. So for example, in the United States, if you can see it here, I'll read it. The number of clinical trials between the period, two decades, between the period of 2000 to 2020, around this period, there were about 70,000 clinical trials conducted in the United States. If you compare the percentage shared of clinical trials to the global number of clinical trials, they contribute to around 50% of total clinical trials in the world. Okay? Now, let's look at it from pharma companies' point of view. If we will link the percentage of clinical trials coming from a country to their pharmaceutical expenditure, you will see in well-matured industries and countries a correlation. How so? So we said 70,000 in the United States clinical trials in 20 years' time, around 50% of the global participation, and they consume around 50% of pharmaceutical expenditure. We all know that US is the largest market in the world, right? For pharma. So there is correlation, right? Right. Let's go to Saudi Arabia. We contribute around 344 of interventional clinical trials. We contributed around 344 of interventional clinical trials over the past, let's say, 2 decades. The percentage of shared clinical trials globally is only 0.2%. If we look at the pharmaceutical expenditure that we contribute to, we actually contribute to around 0.7. So do you see the discrepancy here? United States, 50% clinical trials of the world, 50% of pharma market. Saudi Arabia, 0.2 of the pharma market, global pharma market, but, sorry, 0.2 of the clinical trials, but 0.7 of the global pharma expenditure. What does this mean? It means that we're lagging behind when it comes to the correlation between clinical trials and pharma expenditure. So again, and to those who work in pharma industry, we're consuming your products, but you're not contributing enough to the clinical trials. That's the message. I know things are gonna change, inshallah, in the future. Now, let's compare ourselves to, come on, America, we're not gonna compare ourselves to the United States, right? Let's compare ourselves to similar countries in terms of the population, GDP, and see where we stand, okay? So, if you look at this graph, you will see this is the GDP per capita, which is almost the same if you compare Saudi Arabia, Japan, South Korea, Italy, France, Spain. Almost in the same category, okay? We're not talking about Switzerland, for example. We're not talking about US. Let's take the same or the similar GDP per capita and see where they land when it comes to the clinical trials contribution. Spain, for example, I don't know if you can see this. Spain, for example, contribute to around 215 clinical trials, while Saudi Arabia contribute to around 15 clinical trial per million population. This is 215 per million population. This is 15, around 15 million 15 per million population. Do you see the discrepancy, the wide discrepancy? Okay. Right. If you look at the different pharma countries over the same period, the last 2 decades, GSK, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, Novartis, Merck, Lilly, BI, Roche, Sanofi, and Bristol Myers have contributed the most in terms of clinical trials, depending on whether they are in phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. If you look at, for example, GSK, you can see that for phase 3, they have contributed to around 817 different clinical trials. Phase 1 is around 1,000. Same thing if you look at Bristol Myers, you'll see 217 and 428. Now, this is going to change. This map is going to change. Why? This is why. Because the landscape of clinical trials when it comes to therapeutics is actually changing. In the past, we used to focus more on chronic diseases, okay? Now, rare diseases are gaining more momentum in terms of clinical trials and also the introduction of newer therapeutic areas in rare diseases that had no treatment in the past or offering advanced therapeutic modalities for existing rare diseases with therapy. So rare disease is taking a lot of emphasis from pharma industries, and you can see the increase in rare disease over the past, would say, 10 years only. Cell and gene therapy, do you see the huge jump of cell and gene therapy over the last 10 years? This one, okay? It is expected, currently there are about at least here in Saudi Arabia, there are about 8 different gene therapies approved. It's expected in a matter of 3 to 5 years, we're going to have around 100 different gene therapies approved in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, of course. Diabetes will continue to be a main goal, however, for clinical trials. However, it went a little bit down over the last 2 years, but it will pick up because diabetes is actually a major, I would say, chronic disease that affects the whole globe. Obesity is gaining momentum thanks to the introduction of GLP-1, GLP-1, and GIP analogs. We've seen huge increase in these areas. Now, the different colors that you can see here represents phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. Okay? So you can see actually, look at this, for example, phase 1 is going up, phase 2, phase 3. Okay? Okay. So what about Saudi Arabia? Saudi Arabia is well positioned to drive clinical trials in the whole MENA region and even beyond. Why? We contribute a lot to the pharma market. We are the largest pharma market in the MENA region. We also have good sized population and diverse population. We also have very good health system structure, and we have enough well-trained clinicians who can actually drive these clinical trials. This is the main reasons, but there are other reasons. We, unfortunately, are not proud of this. We do have major issue with chronic diseases such as diabetes, obesity. Did you see the previous slides where diabetes and obesity are going up? Also, we do have, and again, unfortunately, higher prevalence of almost all rare diseases because of consanguinity. And you saw rare diseases where it's going with clinical trials. So this is huge potential for Saudi Arabia to contribute to clinical trials. The good thing is, recently we have also established governance regulations when it comes to clinical trials. We established the Saudi NIH. Saudi FDA has actually released guidance for clinical trial, conducting clinical trials in Saudi Arabia. And we streamlined clinical trial approval. In the past, it used to go to CAST, the national IRB, the local IRB, and there is no one governance process. But now we know how it goes. Also, we do have now more grants coming from government and non-government organizations such as RDIA and Saudi NIH. Okay. Who are the stakeholders? I think you all know. Everybody in this room is a stakeholder for clinical trials and beyond. So I have Ministry of Health, Saudi FDA, we do have the RDIA, Saudi NIH, Ministry of Education, because of the universities and the availability of university hospitals will train clinical professionals and academics. We do also have research institutions such as KFSHRC, KMARC, King Fahd Medical City, King Fahd Specialist Hospital in Dammam, and King Abdullah Medical City in Mecca, and of course pharma industry. All of those are clinical, stakeholders. Now let's look at the number of clinical trials over the last decade. So this represents the different phases of clinical trials, the different colors. Okay, so you can see the gray one. This is the non-interventional clinical trials. And these are the interventional, the other different colors in phase 1, 2, and 3. Okay? What do you notice here? Two things. One, we have very high percentage of non-interventional clinical trials. Okay? That's not bad, okay? But it's not that good. Number two, we have very limited phase 1 clinical trials, as you can see, the dark blue. So these are two areas for improvement here in Saudi Arabia. Now, we talked about the total number of clinical trials. Unfortunately, we're not doing good. We talked about the type of clinical trials, phase 1, phase 2. Phase 1 is almost negligible in Saudi Arabia, unfortunately. And we talked about the non-interventional clinical trials. Now, the main areas where clinical trials were conducted here in Saudi Arabia included mainly oncology, ID, endocrinology, hematology, cardiovascular diseases. This is not bad, but doesn't really reflect on the new changes that are happening in the global landscape of clinical trials, like rare diseases, cell and gene therapy, diabetes, obesity. We talked about it. Okay? Now, look at 2013 percentage of industry-sponsored clinical trials. This message is for you, industry. 2013, 41% contributed or supported clinical trials versus 2023, 54. So there is an increase. Thank you. Well, the increase is not that great over a period of almost 10 years. So there is, again, room for improvement to the contribution of pharma industries when it comes to clinical trials. Okay, so we talked about the role of Saudi FDA in establishing the Saudi Clinical Trial Registry in 2009 and the guidance for clinical trials. The most important reasons for establishing such initiative is to improve transparency of drug clinical trials, precision of the study application, and also ensuring study adherence to the protocol, the ethical, and also to the clinical protocol. If you look at other entities contributing to clinical trials enhancement in Saudi Arabia and improvement, KMARC is a major clinical trial institute. In fact, KMARC is the only phase 1 approved clinical trial institute currently in Saudi Arabia. And this is the reason why we don't have enough phase 1 clinical trials, is the limited number of accredited phase 1 institutes. SNIH was established in August 2023 and was approved through a royal decree in 2024. The institute has two main functions: one, encouraging, enhancing, and training on clinical trials and clinical research, and the second objective of SNIH is grants, and we're going to hear from SNIH more details today, inshallah. The Saudi Clinical Trial Enterprise is actually a network dedicated to building and enhancing clinical trials capacity. It's not really an official entity, but it's more of a network for collaboration of clinical trials. Now, these are the aims of SNIH, and I'm going to leave it for our colleagues in SNIH when they talk about SNIH. Dr. Abdullah, thank you. Well, these are the strategic pillars of SNIH and the key focus areas in terms of training, development, networking platform, awareness campaigns, science assessment, and upscaling. If you remember the national biotech strategy that was announced by His Royal Highness, the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, focused on four main pillars. If you read the biotech strategy in Saudi Arabia, and I'm sure you did, three of them were in health, which puts a lot of emphasis on biotech in health And part of every pillar is clinical trials. So vaccines, genomics, biologicals, all of them included clinical trials aspects, part of them. Now, Ministry of Health is leading the Red Biotech part of the whole national biotech strategy. So Red Biotech, for those who are not familiar, means health-related biotech, okay? So we're leading it, and it focused, as I said, on vaccines, biologicals, and genomics. Genomics, either preventive or therapeutic. One of the main streams within the Red Biotech is the clinical trials and research and development to expand and upscale clinical trials, also contracting clinical trials to Ministry of Health, hospitals, and the first initiative is already placed to build a CTU in King Saud Medical City, which I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. Okay. Ministry of Health is working currently to develop what we call the Clinical Trial Operation Management Unit. This is headquartered in the Ministry of Health, and the main reason for developing CTOMU is to coordinate the different CTUs or the clinical trial units among different hospitals. We do have our stakeholders involved in this initiative, including pharma industry, hospitals, clinicians, research institutes, and others. So the main goal for the CTOMU is to streamline clinical trials operation, maximize the resource allocation, select appropriate investigators and sites. Okay, so if you, for example, come to Ministry of Health CTOMU and you'd like to target, let's say, patients with sickle cell, thalassemia. We know which hospitals that have clinical trial units that are able to conduct research and clinical research in this patient population, where they have the patient mix and the patient flow and enough patient population. Also support patient engagement. On the other hand, we have worked on building what we call the the Rare Disease Center of Excellence. And the main aspects of Center of Excellence of Rare Diseases within Ministry of Health is clinical research, health technology and economic evaluations, digital care pathways, disease registries, and capacity building. Very quick about the clinical trials. We do have multiple challenges, and I'm sure we're going to discuss a lot of challenges today, but also I'm going to go over them really quick because of time. Fatma's looking at me. And also address really quick solutions. So we do have issues with the incentive package for international sponsors. So if you talk to to pharma industry, for example, they always ask, what is it for us to come in Saudi Arabia? Are we going to get enough patient enrollment? Are we going to get approval on time? Are we going to get a certain contribution to the economy where we can leverage this with other government entity? So what is it for us? So it's very important that this incentive package is communicated very clearly to pharma industries, because most clinical trials that involve medications are sponsored by pharma. We do also need to capitalize on building more capabilities and capacities when it comes to specialized infrastructure and staff working in clinical research. Also site selection, conducting feasibility assessments, getting accredited, approved, because sponsors are not going to come to a hospital where they don't have approval or accreditation somehow locally or internationally as a clinical trial site. Also clinical trial budgeting and contracting. This is one of the most needed issues that needs to be streamlined to improve clinical trials. Currently, In many institutions, they don't have policies that regulates how they should spend the grants coming from industry for conducting certain clinical trials. Should it go to Ministry of Finance? Should it go to Ministry of Health? How are we going to use it? What chapter are we going to use it for? All of these needs to be addressed, and I think this is very important. IRB process and timeline, it's very important to have to streamline the IRB approval. Timeline is very important for every single clinical trial in the world. If you are delayed in approval, then you are delayed in patient recruitment or enrollment, and ultimately you are not going to be able to participate in such clinical trial. Site reviews and approvals, we talked about them. Compensation to the site, compensation to the investigators, to the clinical researchers, as well as compensation to the site itself for hosting such a clinical trial, patient reimbursement. Also, we need guidance, we need policies. How are we going to reimburse patients? There are certain things that we cannot reimburse patients for, as you all know, according to the laws and regulations. So a clear pathway for compensating patients is very important. Also, dedicated infrastructure, research personnel, and training those research personnel in enough quality and quantity in order to be able to expand. Also, participants' engagements and retention. One of the main issues in all clinical trials is retention of enrolled patients. So dropout is a major factor in all clinical trials. Also, clinical trials tracking and management solutions, patient tracking solutions, and collaboration framework. So we worked in the Ministry of Health to establish what we call pillars for a robust clinical trial ecosystem by assessing site infrastructure, collaboration, partnership, and we took actually a pilot with King Saud Medical City, innovation and technology, patient recruitment, startup timelines, and capacity building. We talked about the CTO-MU, and the clinical research site assessment and feasibility. We did this with King Saud Medical City, where we worked to establish the capabilities within King Saud Medical City, setting the stage for clinical trials, maximizing also clinical trials, starting from study setup, trial protocol, IRB approval, investigators' responsibilities, trainings, quality controls, and handling non-compliance. All of this we worked it and piloted it at King Saud Medical City, and recently we had the first research day in R1 or Cluster 1 in Riyadh, where we announced this. Also, effective capacity building within the clinical research site is very important in terms of clinical research coordinators, research nurses, data managers, regulatory specialists. All of these are extremely important for us, so that's why we worked closely with King Saud Medical City. This is the last slide, Fatima. Competency-based training could be adopted to help advance clinical trials capability across sites, and this should be really a priority if we would like to improve clinical trial localization of clinical trials in Saudi Arabia and more adoption of clinical trials in Saudi Arabia. I think capability building is a major step forward. Efficient training is extremely important, and I hope this research day would increase the awareness among all clinical practitioners and researchers about conducting efficient training in all different areas or potential sites, study sites. Tailored programs addressing essential competencies, and finally collaborations with all stakeholders, including academic centers, because we see the level of clinical trials coming from academic centers, and these are not up to the expectations. We expect much more. We expect academic centers to lead the clinical trials here in Saudi Arabia. So There are multiple factors that we need to work on, including regulations, submission delays, additional requirements, local versus central IRB, because now currently you have to get a local IRB, then followed by a central IRB if it's related to a medical device or medical supply or a medication by Saudi FDA. Backlogs is very important, so we do not discourage clinical researchers, we do not discourage industry from contributing to clinical trials, contract and budgeting negotiations as we talked about. With this, and I would like to leave you with some slides. These are some numbers that I will leave it without even discussing it, so that you can appreciate the difficulty of conducting a clinical trial to its end. I'm just going to highlight one point. 80% of clinical trials fail to meet enrollment deadline. So this ends up with either not including patients, okay, or not participating or not completing the clinical trial, unfortunately. These are not good numbers, but we really need to build what we call the Saudi system for conducting clinical trials and improving the clinical trial ecosystem here in Saudi Arabia. Thank you very much.